Shalom. Okay, have I got a story for you? Now, I have to be honest. I don't know if this story is 100% true or not, but I think it is, and I've heard it, and I love the story. And even if it's an exaggeration, and even if it might not be 100% true, it can really teach us a great lesson about davening and about Emunah and Hashem and about the wonderful mitzvah of tzitzis. In one of Israel's wars, there was a hilltop. And on this hilltop, there was one lone tank, a tank like this in my background here, that was guarding this hilltop. And it was guarding the hilltop and making sure, and it didn't know, the people inside the tank didn't know that a war was about to start. And they had no idea that the enemy was just over the mountain. They had no idea that just on the other side of the mountain, where they could not see, it was in the middle of the night, they couldn't see, they had no idea that there was an entire Syrian army and tons of Syrian tanks waiting for the order to move up the mountain towards this one tank. And there's no way that this one tank could have held off the battle that would have happened had those tanks attacked. And the Israeli soldiers inside this tank sat in their tank, and they were ready, they were on guard, and they heard noise that they weren't used to hearing. There was strange noises occurring. They weren't sure what it was. And one of the soldiers got out of the tank in the middle of the night, took out his binoculars, and looked out onto the fields. Didn't see anything different, but then all of a sudden, he saw a glint of light. And he realized the glint of light was coming from a tank. And he used that light to see the rest of the field. And in front of him, before his very eyes, he couldn't believe it, there were 100 Syrian tanks, only a couple of meters away from him. He could not believe it. He was terrified. He was so scared, he had trouble walking back to his tank. And he got back to his tank. He came inside, and his fellow soldier said, "Whoa, what was the noise?" And he couldn't even get his breath. And they said, "Whoa, calm down, talk." And he said very quietly, "There are 100 Syrian tanks right over the mountain." And they said, "What do you mean 100 Syrian tanks?" He said, "There are 100 Syrian tanks, and they're about to attack us." So they radioed in back to their base, and they said, "There's 100 Syrian tanks ready to attack us. What should we do?" And the commanding officer on the radio said, "Hold on." And the commanding officer radioed his commanding officer, who radioed the generals all the way back in Tel Aviv. And the generals came back and they said, "We're going to send reinforcements, but it's going to take a couple of hours." And the people in the tank sat there and they said, "If they decide to attack, we're not going to have a couple of minutes, let alone a couple of hours. How are we going to protect ourselves?" And all of a sudden, they start hearing rumbling. You start hearing the threads of the tanks, the tires moving, and they start hearing the 100 tanks move up. And what they didn't know was, in those 100 tanks sat Syrian soldiers just like them, Syrian tank drivers just like Israeli tank drivers, young men who weren't the bravest. They were scared. They were about to go into war. They knew that not everybody survives war. War is very scary. It's not like a movie. And they were just as scared. And they had heard, the Syrian army had heard that Israel had secret weapons. And these secret weapons is what makes Israel so successful on the battlefield. And they were very worried if they got up on their tanks and they moved up the hill. And what happens if they faced one of these secret weapons? Well, back in our story, back to the Israeli tanks hear the Syrian tanks coming. And they know they're one tank against 100. Maybe they'll get one or two shots off, but sooner or later they're going to get overrun by the tanks, and their tank is going to get blown up, and they're not going to survive this war, and they're going to lose, and then those tanks are going to move into Israel. So one of the soldiers, like in this picture behind me, got up on top of his tank, and he put on his talit, and he held up his tzitzit, and he screamed to Hashem, "Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. Hashem, please help us. We're helpless here. Please, you are our Father, help us." And a Syrian tank driver that was leading the charge looked up and saw the Jew aiming his secret weapon at them with strings and he got on the radio and said, halt the attack. Halt the attack. They have the secret weapon. The tank has the secret weapon. They're aiming at us. We're out of range now. Let's halt here. And the Syrian army stopped their advance. The tank stopped. And the Israeli soldier standing on with his tzitzis looks up at the sky and can't believe it worked. His tefillos were answered. He asked Hashem to stop the tanks, and they stopped right when he said Shema Yisrael and begged Hashem to stop the tanks. And he got back in his tank and he said, my tefillos worked. My prayers worked. Hashem listened. They stopped their tanks. And everybody in the tank said, really? He said, all the Syrians stopped. And the Syrians stopped, and that got enough time for Israel's tanks and the reserves to come up. And 100 Israeli tanks came to help the one, and they started firing onto the Syrians, and the Syrians were so scared about the secret weapon that they turned around and retreated. And that's how this one tank and this one soldier with his prayers was able to stop the Syrian army and save everybody's lives. Now, I told you, I don't know 100% if that story is true. I've heard it take place on the Egyptian border, on the Syrian border, in different places, but I'll tell you something. It tells us what our secret weapon really is. The Syrian soldier wasn't wrong. Our secret weapon is that we have Hashem on our side. And if we do mitzvah and we do Torah, Hashem will protect us.